June 7th, 1944. The initial rays of dawn pierced the lingering haze of smoke that still veiled Normandy's hedgerows. Sergeant Bill Morrison, a member of the 29th Infantry Division, found himself hunkered behind a weathered stone barrier. His gaze was fixed on indistinct shapes moving through the morning mist, approximately 200 yards to his east. For a fleeting moment, his index finger tightened on the trigger of his M1 rifle. Then, he recognized the distinct curvature of their helmets, a flatter brim setting them apart, and their battle dress, a subtly different hue of olive drab. These were British soldiers, advancing from Gold Beach with the objective of linking up with the American sector. Morrison had never encountered a British soldier in person before, nor had anyone in his squad. While they had undergone extensive training in England for several months, these sessions had all taken place on American installations and alongside American units. Now, 36 hours after landing on Omaha Beach, weary and still experiencing residual tremors from the assault, they were poised to meet their allies face to face. "Hold your fire," Morrison commanded in a hushed tone. "They're ours. Well, theirs. You understand what I mean." The approaching British patrol drew nearer. Morrison rose to his feet, extending his hand. The lead British soldier, identifiable as a lieutenant by his insignia, halted his advance. He scrutinized Morrison's group before proceeding forward, his rifle slung casually. He appeared young, perhaps 23 years of age, sporting a slender mustache and an expression of carefully maintained neutrality. "29th Infantry," the British officer inquired, his accent rendering the words clipped and formal. "That's correct," Morrison replied. "You're from Gold Beach, the 57th Division. We're supposed to rendezvous with your chaps around Port Sessa." He gestured towards the rising smoke in the direction of Omaha. "It was a rough go yesterday." Morrison's mind flashed back to the beach, the bodies bobbing in the surf, the 6 hours of sheer terror before they had finally managed to evacuate the sand. "Yes," he acknowledged. "Rough." The British lieutenant offered a single, affirmative nod, as if Morrison had simply confirmed a pre-existing understanding. "Right then, we're advancing towards Bus. Your command is aware we're in this vicinity." "They are now," Morrison stated. The lieutenant offered a faint smile, neither overtly friendly nor entirely distant. "Good show. Carry on." He turned to his men, uttered something Morrison couldn't discern, and the patrol moved past, heading westward. Morrison observed their departure. His corporal, Eddie Hayes from Brooklyn, joined him. "That's it. That's the British. What were you expecting?" "I don't know. More British, I suppose. They look just like us." "Different helmets," Morrison pointed out. "Different uniforms. Did you see their rifles?" "Lee Enfields," Hayes confirmed. "My dad carried one in the last war. Said they're good guns, just a slow bolt action." Morrison nodded. The British soldiers were navigating the hedgerows with practiced deliberation. Each man provided cover for the next, their spacing impeccable, professional, and controlled. "They look like they know what they're doing." "So do we," Hayes countered. But there was a question in his voice. Morrison remained silent, his thoughts occupied by Omaha Beach, the pandemonium, the dread, and the desperate struggle for survival. These British troops moved with a parade ground precision, even here, even now. It was a stark contrast. He couldn't definitively say whether it was superior or inferior, only that it was different. By midday, Morrison's platoon had advanced 2 miles inland and encountered British forces on 3 additional occasions. Each encounter followed a similar pattern: a meticulous identification process, a brief exchange of information, and then continued movement. The British soldiers were courteous, efficient, and remarkably unfazed by the ongoing conflict around them. This composure was beginning to unnerve the American soldiers. Private First Class Tommy Chen, a radio operator from San Francisco, articulated this sentiment during a respite in a farmyard. "They're too calm," he remarked, observing a British squad preparing tea, a literal cup of tea, amidst the ruins of a barn while German artillery fire boomed in the distance. "Don't they realize we're at war?" The British soldiers had set up a small stove, produced tea from an unseen source, and were distributing metal cups while their sergeant consulted a map. One of them was smoking a pipe. A pipe? Morrison had witnessed men smoking cigarettes under fire. That was commonplace. But a pipe suggested a leisurely pursuit, a moment of contemplation, akin to an afternoon in peacetime. "Perhaps that's simply their way," Morrison suggested. "It's peculiar," Chen insisted. "We're all flinching at every sound, and they're having a tea party." A British soldier, a corporal, stout and middle-aged, overheard the exchange and approached, a cup in hand. "Fancy a brew?" he inquired, extending the tea towards Chen. Chen accepted it, sniffing it with suspicion. "Is this actually tea?" "Of course it's tea. What else would it be?" "I don't know. Medicine? Fuel?" The British corporal chuckled, a short, amused bark. "You Yanks and your coffee can't function without it, can you? We're the same with tea. Keeps you steady." He tapped his temple. "Settles the nerves." Chen sipped the tea, his face contorting slightly. "It's hot." "That's rather the point." Morrison accepted a cup when it was offered. The tea was strong and bitter, vastly unlike the sweet iced tea his mother made back in Virginia. However, it was warm, and the British corporal was correct. There was a certain steadiness to it, to the ritual of pausing, preparing, drinking, and continuing. The British had been engaged in this war for 5 years. Perhaps this was their method of enduring for so long: the preparation of tea, the adherence to routines, the preservation of their humanity. "How long have you been fighting?" Morrison asked the corporal. "Since 1940. Dunkirk, North Africa, Sicily, and now here." The corporal stated it plainly, devoid of pride or complaint, merely reciting facts. "You've been at it 2 days." The corporal studied Morrison's face before nodding. "You'll get accustomed to it, or you won't. Either way, keep your head down and your rifle clean." He finished his tea, collected his cup, and rejoined his squad. Hayes leaned in closer to Morrison. 4 years of combat, and he's brewing tea in a barn. Either they're crazy, or we are. "Perhaps both," Morrison mused. The divergences became increasingly evident as the day progressed. Morrison's platoon was assigned to a British company for an advance towards a crossroads 2 miles to the south. The British captain, a tall, slender man named Petton, briefed the combined force with the same measured, slightly indifferent tone his high school principal used when discussing detention policies. "The objective is this crossroads," Petton stated, indicating his map. Jerry has a machine gun position here, possibly a mortar team here. We'll advance in 2 columns, suppress the machine gun, and clear the position. Any questions? Morrison raised his hand. What if they possess more than 1 machine gun? Then we'll suppress both, Petton replied, as if this were self-evident. The key is to maintain formation and avoid bunching up. Jerry relishes it when you bunch up. It simplifies his task. Morrison had a dozen more questions. What about flanking fire? What about reinforcements? What about artillery support? But Petton had already moved on, issuing directives to his platoon leaders with the same unhurried precision. The British soldiers listened, nodded, and meticulously checked their weapons with practiced efficiency. No one appeared nervous. No one seemed agitated. They simply appeared ready. The American platoon leader, Lieutenant Kowalski, pulled Morrison aside. "What do you think?" "I believe they've done this before," Morrison responded. "So have we." "Not like this. Not 4 years' worth." Kowalski frowned. "You think we should follow their lead?" Morrison considered. The British approach was methodical, careful, almost bordering on cautious. The American method, at least as they had been trained, involved striking hard and fast, overwhelming the enemy with aggression and overwhelming firepower. Distinct philosophies, distinct experiences. "I think we should observe and learn," Morrison finally stated. The advance commenced at noon. The British moved forward in textbook formations, each squad providing cover for the subsequent one, utilizing every available piece of concealment. They advanced slowly, perhaps too slowly, Morrison thought. Initially, his instinct urged him to sprint, to traverse the open ground swiftly. But the British took their time, and, as they progressed, Morrison began to grasp their rationale. They never exposed themselves unnecessarily. They exploited the terrain with absolute perfection. When they encountered resistance, they did not charge forward. Instead, they halted, assessed the situation, brought up supporting weaponry, and suppressed the enemy position before proceeding. It was akin to observing a meticulously operating machine, each component moving in perfect synchrony with the others. The German machine gun opened fire when the leading British squad was 50 yards from the crossroads. The squad immediately dropped to the ground, returning fire while their sergeant relayed coordinates. Within 30 seconds, a British mortar team had accurately ranged the position. 3 rounds later, the machine gun ceased its fire. "Advance!" Petton commanded, and the British resumed their forward movement. The same pace, the same precision. Morrison's squad followed, endeavoring to match the British rhythm. It felt unnatural. Morrison was tempted to bolt, to reach cover rapidly, but he forced himself to maintain the British pace. Hayes, beside him, was breathing heavily. "This is taking forever," he grumbled. "But we're not getting shot at," Morrison pointed out. They reached the crossroads 15 minutes later. The German position was deserted, the crew having withdrawn when the mortars found them. The British immediately established defensive positions, dispatched patrols, and secured a perimeter. There was no jubilation, no overt relief, simply the commencement of the next task. Petton found Morrison. "Your men performed admirably. Excellent fire discipline." "We followed your lead," Morrison admitted. "Sensible. You'll develop your own style in time, Everyone does. Peyton produced a cigarette case, actual silver with intricate engraving, and offered one to Morrison. The key is surviving long enough to develop that style. Morrison accepted the cigarette. Is it always this controlled for you? Good Lord, no. At times it descends into complete chaos, but one strives to maintain structure regardless. It provides the men with something to cling to. Peyton lit both their cigarettes. You chaps came across at Omaha. Yes, sir. I heard it was rather rough, worse than ours. It was bad, Morrison stated, offering no further elaboration. Peyton nodded, refraining from probing further. Well, you are here now. That is what matters. He checked his watch. Morrison noted it was a pocket watch, not a wristwatch. We'll hold this position until dusk, then push forward another mile. Your lieutenants are coordinating with my second-in-command. Ensure your men are fed and rested. Morrison saluted. The British returned salutes differently, he observed, more casually, almost like a wave, and then rejoined his squad. They had discovered a shell crater and were sharing their rations. Hayes had somehow procured a British ration tin and was examining it with scientific curiosity. It contains tea, Hayes announced. The ration includes tea, not coffee. Ta? Of course it does, Chen chimed in. Probably has crumpets, too. What's a crumpet? I don't know. Something British. Morrison sat down, retrieving his own rations. The British soldiers nearby were consuming their meals, conversing quietly amongst themselves. Their discourse differed from typical American banter, being more understated, laced with dry wit and references Morrison did not comprehend. One of them was engrossed in a book, actually reading while eating. Morrison couldn't fathom possessing the composure to read in a combat zone. A British private noticed Morrison observing and approached, holding his ration tin. Fancy a swap? I'll trade you my tinned beef for your... What is that? Spam, Morrison replied. Spam, the British soldier repeated, as if savoring the sound of the word. What's it made of? Mr. Meat. Ah, same as ours. The soldier then sat down uninvited, produced a cigarette, and lit it. You chaps did well today. First time working with us. First time seeing you, Morrison corrected. Really? I thought you'd been training in England. We were, but we never actually encountered any British soldiers, just trained on our own bases. The British private considered this. That's daft. We're supposed to be allies, and they kept us segregated. What did they imagine would happen when we met? Perhaps they thought we'd be too dissimilar, Hayes suggested. Are we? The British soldier inquired. Different, Morrison reflected. Yes, but not in a negative way, just different. Well, that's all right then. The British private stood, brushing off his battle dress. Name's Reg, by the way. Reg Cooper, Sheffield. Bill Morrison, Virginia. Virginia? That's in the South, isn't it? You grow tobacco there. In some places, right? Well, Bill Morrison from Virginia. Try not to get shot. I'd hate to lose a new friend so quickly. Reg ambled back to his own squad, leaving Morrison somewhat perplexed as to whether they were indeed friends, or if that was simply British humor. He was odd, Chen commented. They're all odd, Hayes added, but in a good way, I think. Morrison remained uncertain about the categorization of good or bad, but he was beginning to comprehend that the British possessed their own distinct approach to warfare, their own unique method of survival, and it was effective for them. It might not be suitable for Americans. It probably wouldn't be, but it merited respect. As evening descended, further interactions between American and British units occurred as they consolidated their positions and established defensive lines for the night. Morrison's platoon was positioned alongside a British platoon in a hedgerow emplacement overlooking a valley. The British immediately commenced enhancing their position, digging deeper, establishing fields of fire, and organizing a rotation for watch duty. The Americans, utterly exhausted from 2 days of combat, largely collapsed and attempted to rest. The British platoon sergeant, a man named Davies, whose Welsh accent was so pronounced that Morrison could barely understand him, approached after dark. "Your lads look knackered," he remarked to Lieutenant Kowalski. "We are knackered," Kowalski conceded, whatever that means. "Tired, exhausted, done in," Davies squatted beside them. "When did you last have a proper sleep before we boarded the boats?" "2 days ago." Davies whistled softly. "Right. Here's what we'll do. My lads will take the initial watch. We're accustomed to it. Your boys sleep until midnight. Then we'll swap. Fair enough?" Kowalski hesitated. "Are you sure? That's a considerable amount of watch duty for your men." "They can manage. Besides, you're no use to anyone if you're falling asleep on watch." Davies stood. "Get some kip. We'll rouse you if Jerry makes an appearance." Morrison felt an urge to object. It seemed improper to allow the British to shoulder such a burden, but he was too fatigued to argue. He found a spot leaning against the hedge, wrapped his jacket around himself, and was asleep within minutes. He awoke to a gentle shaking of his shoulder. It was still dark. Reg Cooper was crouched beside him. "Midnight. Your watch." Morrison sat up groggily. "Did anything happen?" "Quiet as a church. Jerry's probably as tired as you lot." Reg handed him a canteen. "Tea's still hot. Well, warmish." Morrison drank. The tea was sweet this time, with condensed milk. It cut through the mental fog. "Thanks." "No worries. Your mates are on watch at that gap there." Reg pointed to Hayes's position. "We've got the left flank covered. Anything moves in that valley, we'll spot it." He started to depart, then turned back. "Oh, and Morrison, your snoring could wake the dead. Might want to work on that." Morrison spent his watch observing the British positions. Even in the darkness, with half the platoon asleep, they maintained discipline. The sentries remained alert, moved at regular intervals to prevent slumber, and communicated using hand signals. When Davies made his rounds, he paused to converse quietly with each sentry, assessing not only their alertness, but also their emotional state. It was a level of professionalism that transcended mere training. It was habit, routine, the accumulated wisdom of years at war. Dawn broke, cold and gray. The British were already awake, brewing tea, cleaning their weapons, and preparing for the day. The Americans stirred reluctantly, stiff and sore. Morrison noted the disparity in their morning routines. The Americans were informal, bordering on chaotic, each man attending to his own needs, grabbing food whenever possible, checking weapons haphazardly. The British were structured, Tea first, invariably, then weapon maintenance, followed by breakfast, and finally equipment checks. "It's the same every morning," Davies explained. "Routine keeps you sane." "Don't you ever just want to sleep in?" Jen inquired, observing the British proceed through their morning ritual. "Sleep in and get killed," Davies replied cheerfully. "Jerry relishes a lazy morning. Attacks at dawn, always does. So we're up before dawn, ready for him. Disappoints him terribly." The day presented new challenges and further observations. Morrison's platoon was assigned to a British company for a clearance operation through a series of farms. The British captain, distinct from Piton, this one named Ashford, briefed them on the plan. It was intricate, involving multiple phases, precise timing, and careful coordination. The Americans were accustomed to simpler directives. Go there, seize that, hold it. The British approach was more elaborate. "Is it always this complicated?" Kowalski inquired. "This is simple," Ashford stated. "You should witness a full-scale set-piece attack. Pages of orders, dozens of units, artillery timings down to the minute." He observed Kowalski's expression. "Don't fret. You'll either become accustomed to it or you'll develop your own approach. Americans typically do." The operation commenced at 800 hours. The British advanced through the farms with methodical precision, clearing each structure, inspecting each field, and advancing in carefully planned increments. The Americans, assigned to the right flank, attempted to match the pace, but found themselves continually wanting to move faster. Morrison consistently had to restrain his squad. "Match the British rhythm. Why are we proceeding so slowly?" Hayes complained. "We could have finished by now." "Because they intend to be alive when they finish," Morrison countered. "Observe them. They eschew risks." It was undeniably true. The British operated under the assumption that every building was defended, every hedgerow concealed an ambush, and every gateway was booby-trapped. They meticulously inspected everything, secured everything, and thoroughly cleared every area before advancing. It was a slow process. But by the time they had cleared the farms, they had discovered 3 German positions that would have undoubtedly caught a more hasty force by surprise. During a lull, Morrison conversed with a British lieutenant named Thornton, a young officer who had experienced Dunkirk as a private and had ascended through the ranks. "How do you maintain such patience?" Morrison asked. "How do you move this deliberately without losing your mind?" Thornton smiled. "It's not slow to us. It's thorough. There's a distinction." He lit a cigarette. "In 1940, we moved with speed, attempted to match the German tempo. We were soundly defeated at Dunkirk. After that, we learned you cannot outpace the Germans in their blitzkrieg. However, you can be more prudent, more methodical, more professional. That is our advantage. Now, doesn't that frustrate you, being so deliberate?" "Frustration leads to death," Thornton stated. "Patience ensures survival. We've lost enough men learning that lesson. I'd much prefer you chaps learn it by observing us, rather than through your own casualties." Morrison's thoughts drifted to Omaha Beach, to the men who had charged forward only to be cut down, to the pervasive chaos and confusion. "Perhaps you are right." "Of course I'm right. I'm British. We are always right," Thornton grinned. "That's a jest, by the way. We aren't always right. But we've been doing this longer than you, so we've made more mistakes and gleaned more lessons. Adopt what suits you. Disregard the rest." By mid-afternoon, the farms were cleared. The British had captured 12 German soldiers without sustaining a single casualty. The Americans had acquired a valuable lesson in patience, in meticulousness, in the British conduct of warfare. It was not exhilarating, it was not glorious, but it was undeniably effective. That evening, Morrison's platoon shared a bivouac with a British platoon in a captured German emplacement. The British immediately commenced fortifying the position, a typical response, while the Americans collapsed in exhaustion, also typical. However, on this occasion, several Americans assisted with the improvements, having come to understand that the British habit of constant preparedness was not born of paranoia, but rather of a deep-seated instinct for survival. The British produced their rations, and this time Americans and British mingled freely, sharing food and stories. Hayes traded his chocolate for British tinned pudding. Chen managed to get a British soldier to explain cricket, understood absolutely nothing, but appreciated the endeavor. Morrison found himself in conversation with Davies, discussing their lives before the conflict, their families, and their hopes for the future once hostilities ceased. "Are you married?" Davies inquired. "I have a fiancée back home in Richmond. My wife and 2 children are in Cardiff. I haven't seen them in 3 years." Davies produced a worn photograph showing Morrison a smiling woman and 2 children. He commented on the toll war takes on families, asking if Morrison believed it would conclude soon. Glancing at the darkening sky, Davies noted their presence in France as a positive step, but acknowledged that the enemy was not yet defeated, and the road to Berlin remained long. He carefully put the photograph away, stating his conviction they would reach their objective, with the Americans and British fighting together. He explained their complementary strengths. The Americans excelled in aggression, speed, and firepower, delivering swift, forceful blows, while the British were adept at holding ground, defending, and attrition. This combination, he smiled, kept the enemy disoriented. A British soldier then began singing a music hall tune Morrison didn't recognize, soon joined by others. The Americans listened, amused by the lyrics about a lady from Brighton and her unfortunate taste in companions. Subsequently, Hayes initiated an American song, met with similar bemused attention from the British. Though neither side fully grasped the other's melodies, it mattered little. Reg Cooper approached and sat with Morrison. "You lot are all right," he remarked. "A bit boisterous, a bit disorganized, but all right." Morrison reciprocated. "You're not too bad yourselves. A bit too fond of tea, a bit too composed under fire, but not bad." "Too composed under fire? Is there such a thing?" Reg chuckled. "When you're brewing tea while bullets are flying, yes, there is." Reg conceded. "Fair point. But the tea helps. It keeps you human, reminds you there's a world beyond the fighting." He offered Morrison a cigarette from his pack. "You know what I think? I believe you Yanks will win this war for us. You have the numbers, the equipment, the spirit. But I think we'll teach you how to endure it. A fair exchange." Morrison accepted the cigarette, letting Reg light it. "A fair exchange," he agreed. The following morning brought orders to advance. The British were heading east towards Cong, while the Americans moved west towards Sherborne. The alliance was parting ways, each contingent pursuing its own objectives. As Morrison's platoon formed up, the British platoon they had spent 2 days with came to bid farewell. Davies shook Kowalski's hand, wishing him luck and advising him to keep his head down. The sentiment was returned. Reg Cooper handed Morrison a paper-wrapped item for the journey. Morrison unwrapped it to find a full tin of British Army tea. "I don't know how to make it," he admitted. "You'll figure it out. Hot water, tea, a bit of milk if you have it, a bit of sugar if you're fortunate. Drink it when things get tough. It reminds you you're still human." Reg extended his hand. "See you in Berlin, Morrison." Morrison clasped it. "See you in Berlin, Cooper." The two forces departed in opposing directions. Morrison glanced back once, seeing the British disappearing into the hedgerows, moving with the same deliberate precision he had come to recognize. They were different from the Americans, a distinct style, pace, and approach, yet effective, professional, and deserving of respect. Hayes joined him. "Do you think we'll see them again?" "Perhaps. This is a vast war, but the front is not endless. Paths will cross." "I hope so. I was beginning to like them. Even the tea." Morrison smiled. "Even the tea." They marched west towards their assigned objectives and battles, but Morrison carried the tin of tea in his pack. 3 weeks later, when his platoon found itself pinned down in a village south of Cherbourg, exhausted and frightened, he retrieved it and prepared tea for his squad. It was dreadful. He had no idea what he was doing, but it provided solace. It reminded them they were still human, still alive, still fighting. When they finally captured the village and discovered British supplies in a seized German depot, Morrison smiled at the stacks of tea cases in the corner. Different armies, different methods, yet some things were universal. The British cherished their tea, the Americans their coffee, and both required each other for victory. Observations made by American troops regarding their British counterparts in the initial days following D-Day were varied and intricate. Some Americans perceived the British as too deliberate, overly cautious, and excessively procedural. Others, however, admired their professional demeanor, their composure, and their seasoned experience. Most occupied a middle ground, acknowledging that the British approach to warfare was distinct but not inherently flawed, effective within its specific context, and worthy of consideration, if not direct adoption. The British, in turn, viewed the Americans as aggressive, informal, and at times impetuous. Yet they also recognized the Americans' dynamism, their optimistic outlook, and their eagerness to learn. The two forces represented distinct outcomes of different military traditions and varied wartime experiences. Nevertheless, they learned to collaborate, to enhance each other's strengths, and to compensate for each other's deficiencies. In correspondence to their families, American soldiers described their British allies with a blend of amusement and admiration. They frequently mentioned the tea and the British composure under fire, their discipline, and their understated sense of humor. They discussed tactical disparities, equipment differences, and cultural divergences, but predominantly expressed their discovery that, despite these variations, they were united in purpose, confronting the same adversary and striving towards a shared objective. A soldier from the 29th Infantry Division wrote to his sister in July of 1944, "The British are peculiar fellows. They drink tea when coffee would be more appropriate. They remain calm when apprehension would seem logical. And they advance slowly when haste is required. However, they have been engaged in this conflict for 5 years, and they persist, still fighting, still professional. I suppose they must be doing something right. We could learn from them." "I believe we are." Another American soldier, a lieutenant from the 4th Infantry Division, documented in his diary, "Connected with British units today near Carentan. I had anticipated them to be aloof and formal as portrayed in films. Some exhibit those traits, but most are simply soldiers like ourselves, attempting to survive, to fulfill their duties, and to return home. They have their customs, we have ours. Both are effective. That is what counts. The rapport between American and British forces in Normandy was not always seamless. Disagreements arose concerning tactics, strategy, and the allocation of credit for successes or blame for failures. Friction existed between differing command philosophies, operational rhythms, and military cultures. Yet, beneath these divergences lay mutual esteem, forged through shared hardship and a common mission. The British had been at war since 1939, fighting in France, North Africa, and Italy. They had endured the Blitz, weathered Dunkirk, and acquired hard-won lessons in contemporary warfare. They brought to the alliance experience, professionalism, and earned wisdom. The Americans contributed fresh vigor, immense industrial might, and bold optimism. Though new to the European theater, they learned rapidly, adapted swiftly, and provided resources the British critically needed. Together, they formed an alliance that would advance across France into Germany, culminating in victory. The initial encounters in Normandy, the first observations and impressions, laid the groundwork for that partnership. American troops perceived their British counterparts as different, yet worthy. British troops viewed the Americans as inexperienced, but promising. Both sides learned from each other, adapted to each other, and fought shoulder to shoulder for the subsequent 11 months until Germany's capitulation. Morrison carried that tin of tea through France into Belgium, across the Rhine, and ultimately to a small Bavarian town where his unit encountered the war's end. He never did master its preparation. It was consistently either too strong or too weak, too bitter or too bland. Nevertheless, he continued to make it, to drink it, and to recall those initial days following D-Day when he learned that allies could be dissimilar and yet remain allies. He understood that respect did not necessitate conformity, and that both the British and American paths could lead to the same destination. On May 8, 1945, upon hearing the news of Germany's surrender, Morrison brewed one last pot of tea, his squad gathering around and accepting their cups without complaint. They had grown accustomed to it by then, and raised their cups in a toast to victory. It was truly dreadful tea, unequivocally awful. Yet it held profound significance. It symbolized their survival. It represented their learning. It signified their shared struggle alongside the British and their emergence victorious. "To the British," Morrison declared, lifting his cup. "To the British," his squad echoed. They drank, winced at the taste, and then laughed. Somewhere in England, British soldiers were likely preparing their own tea, perhaps with greater skill, likely toasting the Americans with the same blend of fondness and exasperation that Americans felt for them. Distinct forces, divergent approaches, yet a shared triumph. That is what American troops conveyed upon encountering British soldiers at D-Day. They described the British as peculiar, formal, composed, professional, devoted to tea, and effective. They commented on the British tendency to move slowly, to deliberate, and to seldom appear fearful. They noted that the British had been engaged in the war for an extended period, which was evident in their caution, their thoroughness, and their avoidance of unnecessary risks. However, their predominant sentiment was that the British were proficient soldiers, valuable allies, and dependable comrades in combat.